Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. The episode 3 of my Ranking the Doctors series, which seems to be quite popular. And once again, I'm obliged to all those of you who have left very reasonable comments and seem to have understood that the point of this series is for me to just express my opinion of my favourite doctors in the 60-year anniversary of Doctor Who. And as I said in each of the previous videos, not just based on a preference for a certain actor, but taking into account the stories, the companions, the creative direction of the series, the feeling that, looking back on an era, that I'm left with about that era, whether I find it satisfying or frustrating or a bit of both. So that's the template for which I've based my rankings, and I think people seem to have understood that it's not just a downer on certain actors. As I've said in each of these videos, all of the actors who played the Doctor have brought something to it. Some more than others, some more successfully than others, but they've all been actors who I think were pretty much appropriate to the part that they were playing at the time they were playing it, with one or two possible exceptions perhaps. So anyway, I'll do a quick reverse run through for those of you who haven't looked at the previous videos yet. Number 13, unfortunately, Mr. Colin Baker. Number 12 is Peter Capaldi. Number 11, I can never remember what SM stands for. It's Sylvester McCoy, of course. Number 10 is Matt Smith. Number 9 is Paul McGann. Number 8, Peter Davison. And number 7 is the most recent Doctor, Jodie Whittaker. Shock horror. Today, I'm going to be looking at number 6, 5, and 4 before we hit the big 3 in the next episode. So let's just crack on with number 6. Number 6 is the one who started it all. The original, you might say. William Hartnell. From 1963 to 1966. And what can you say about the importance of William Hartnell to Doctor Who? There are several actors in this list who, if they hadn't been successful in the part and captured the audience's attention, Doctor Who would just be a footnote in TV science fiction history. Probably a lot of people wouldn't remember it. It certainly wouldn't have been seen. It would have fizzled out. So it's very important that the casting was right from the off, to create the right feeling for this character, to create the myth of this character. And that's what William Hartnell did. I mean, if you look at the episodes now, we're talking about episodes made better part of 60 years ago, of course. And of course, they look very different to today's episodes. They're quite primitive. They're very stagey. The acting is more mannered than we're used to today. But they're still very powerful episodes. They're still very strong stories. If you look back at my review of An Unearthly Child, there could be no better first episode for Doctor Who to introduce the concept of Doctor Who, what it's about, the mystery and the idea of it. And I always say when talking about William Hartnell's Doctor Who, imagine what it must have been like back in 1963, that cold November night, to turn on the TV, to watch this thing. And British TV had never seen anything like this before. There had been science fiction shows before, of course, the Pathfinder series and Quatermass for the adults. But a family audience had never had anything as extraordinarily as imaginative as this. And what made it work, as well as the Daleks, of course, they were what caused the legend of Doctor Who to really be created. But William Hartnell was there at the beginning, this mysterious old man in a junkyard who abducted his granddaughter's school teachers because he couldn't let them back out into the modern world with the knowledge of the TARDIS and him, and whisked them off into this incredible adventure in space and time, taking them to different planets, different time periods, meeting extraordinary creatures, figures from history, and having the most extraordinary adventures. If William Hartnell hadn't created in the idea of the Doctor this crotchety old man, as he's often called, this show wouldn't be here today. So whilst we may look back at that era and think it looks creaky and old-fashioned and primitive, and of course it doesn't have CGI, doesn't have incredible prosthetics, it was made on a budget of about £2,000 an episode, which wasn't much back then for a make a TV programme. We have to accept the importance of that character and that image of the Doctor. And that's an image that a lot of older fans do hang on to, which is why I think sometimes they have trouble adjusting to the more modern contemporary Doctors, who obviously, as William Hartnell did, reflect the time period in which the series was made. Don't forget, when Doctor Who started in 1963, it was only 18 years since World War II had finished. And I wouldn't say that Britain was still a Victoriana sort of society, but I think the image of the Doctor as this Edwardian gentleman was still something which I think people clung on to as an idea of Britain at its finest, you know, going back to the First World War and Victorian times and Edwardian times. And it was a safe and comfortable image for the Doctor. And of course, Hartnell played it with an edge at the beginning. You couldn't trust him. You didn't know what his motives were from, you know, his survival, self-survival was clearly at the forefront of his thinking a lot of the time. Particularly if you think of that episode of the first serial, The Tribe of Gum, where he is about to bludgeon a caveman to death so that he and the others can get back to the TARDIS. That was an element of the Doctor that softened fairly quickly, I think, when Hartnell got used to the character and the writers got used to writing the character, and the producers decided the direction and that the show should have, that the Doctor should be a reassuring figure rather than an ambivalent figure. And this, I think, is why when we've had these ambiguous Doctors in the past, I'm thinking Colin Baker and Peter Capaldi, audience hasn't really warmed to them because they want the Doctor to be a figure that they feel safe with. They don't want the Doctor to be potentially untrustworthy and devious and unlikable. And William Hartnell quickly became this sort of grandfather figure. And it worked, of course, it worked. The audiences flocked to the series. And, of course, we have to take into account the first appearance of the Daleks in 1963, the end of 1963. Again, you know, it's arguable that without the Daleks, the series wouldn't have survived. We'll never know, of course. But I think hats off to William Hartnell. And, of course, it's easy to sort of laugh at him because he fluffed his lines a lot of the time. But we have to take into account two things. Here was a British character actor who'd always played these gritty, earthy, northern, hard-bitten characters. And you're this sort of, I could call him a senior actor. He was only in his 50s at the time. He was suddenly having to learn this like complicated gobbledygook science fiction jargon, which must have been difficult for an actor who wasn't used to that sort of thing. Plus, as we now know, he was already suffering the early effects of arteriosclerosis, which caused him to have to leave the role in 1966. You can see his performance becoming less assured. But yet, he's always a likeable figure. He's always a character that we feel safe with. And he is like, I suppose he becomes like that dotty grandfather figure. So I think we have to acknowledge his importance, because if he hadn't made it work, regardless of the Daleks and the Cybermen that turned up towards the end of his run, if he hadn't made that character work from day one, then the show would have collapsed. So William Hartnell, for that alone, comes in sixth place. I think he has to come in fairly highly in any fan's ranking because we owe him so much. As indeed we do to number 5. Number 5 is Christopher Eccleston.
Fantastic.
Yeah, good old Chris. I mean, again, very similar to William Hartnell. He launched Doctor Who back in 2005 when it had been off the air for the better part of 16 years, apart from the TV movie. And again, if they hadn't cast the right person, if he hadn't delivered the right performance, then the show would have been snuffed out after one series. And I know when they made the series, they didn't know if it was going to take off again. It could have fallen on its face. It could have been that the audience in the 2000s was too invested in reality shows and soaps, because there hadn't been a show like this on television since Doctor Who ended, really. There'd been a couple of half-hearted science fiction shows that hadn't really taken off, but Christopher Eccleston's casting immediately gave it some credibility before it even started, because here's an actor who's well known for a lot of really intense acting performances in cinema and on TV series like Cracker, although he's mainly a cinema actor at that point in theatre and so on. And when it was announced that Doctor was coming back in 2003, of course the newspapers were full of the usual Paul Daniels and Ricky Tomlinson and all these silly casting suggestions, because in the eyes of the press and the public, I suppose, who remember Doctor Who, they remembered its last few years when it was more light-hearted and less of a science fiction series. When Christopher Eccleston was announced, all of a sudden people sat up and took notice. It was like, oh, okay, this is a proper drama. And I know that's what Russell T Davies wanted. He wanted people to accept this was going to be a proper full-blooded drama, not just a spoof. So casting Christopher Eccleston automatically, I think, made people think, oh, blimey, this is going to be good. And it was good. It was fantastic. It was terrific. I mean, it's 18 years ago. That's terrifying enough. But I can remember watching that first episode with that crashing new title sequence and the music and Eccleston's lively performance. And he did bring an everyman quality to it. I mean, that was the point of his costume. The leather jacket and the Doc Martens and the black jeans and tops. Very straightforward, unshowy clothes, which I think the show has tended to move away from a little bit as it's gone on, drifted back into the costume thing. But he was racked with survivor guilt because of the time war. There was a lot of interesting backstory that gave him as an actor a lot of stuff to get his teeth into. You know, coping with the fact that he was the only survivor of his people. This traumatic war with the Daleks, and you see that in the episode Dalek, where he is literally terrified of what he thinks is the last Dalek, if only. His anger at Rose when she wants to go back and change time and save her father. And his fury then in the last few episodes when the Daleks come back en masse. And I think one of the other things that we have to take into account when discussing Christopher Eccleston and his contribution to the series is, as I've said, one of the things that's important that I had to take into consideration in these rankings is the whole ethos and the whole feeling and the creative input into the series. Great as Christopher Eccleston's performance was and the intensity he brought to it, we have to acknowledge the fact that Russell T Davies, taking over as the showrunner for the series, or establishing the concept of the showrunner for Doctor Who, he brought with it a different way of telling stories, a different dynamic, a different pace and energy to the series. And he did that by introducing the concept of sort of a bunch of supporting characters. Now, we'd had this before to an extent back in the Pertwee years with Unit, but this was much more a domestic thing. And I think that was one of the things he was keen to do, and I think it worked well for Christopher Eccleston and David Tennant, who followed in his shoes. The idea of the Doctor's companions having families that they came back to, and mother figures particularly were important for Rose, Martha and later Donna in the David Tennant season. So I think he brought that sense of humanity and family, a domesticity, as the Doctor said a couple of times. I think he said, I don't do domestics. But we had Rose's mum, played by the brilliant Camille Kaduri. We had her long-suffering boyfriend, Mickey, played by Noel Clarke. And we had, of course, Captain Jack Harkness, who appeared just after midway through Eccleston series and carried on into later series, of course, had his own spin-off. So I think it was very fortuitous and very clever of Russell T Davies to give the Doctor other characters to interact with rather than just his companion, because it sort of made him a bit more grounded. I know some fans don't like the idea of the Doctor being grounded, but it gave him a way into the human race, if you like, and it created a warmth, I think, amongst the cast and the idea of the programme to have these recurring characters that you enjoyed seeing. And I think that's something that Russell T Davies is going to go back to for the new Doctor, Ncuti Gatwa, later, beginning of next year. And I think that all came together to help the Eccleston period, and later, as we shall see in the Tennant series, a way in for the casual audience, which made it more than just an adventure in space and time. It was an adventure in humanity and people and relationships. And I know a lot of Doctor Who fans scream that it's too soapy, it's like a soap opera. It isn't like a soap opera. I don't think you can just say that any human situation is a soap opera, because that's not the way it works. And by its very definition, Doctor Who can't be a soap opera. But I think that that's what helps Christopher Eccleston's season be so memorable. It would have been great as it was, but I think having Rose as a very grounded girl from a very grounded, very modern, as it was fairly typical in the early 20th century, that sort of council estate thing, I think it just made it accessible to a larger audience. And I think that's, again, one of the reasons why that era hit home so well and so quickly. It was a difficult time for Christopher Eccleston for all sorts of reasons. He had family problems. His father was very unwell. He had clashes with the production team. And it's a shame that because of that, he only stuck around for 1 year. But what a year. And we have to think, wow, what would it have been like if he'd done 2 or 3 years? He might have done 3 series. I know in an early interview he gave, which was on the BBC's website at the time, he talked about in-between seasons, going back to the theatre and doing other things. So certainly when he started, he planned to stick around. But there's all sorts of reasons why he didn't. A lot of it was to do with the BBC Wales itself wasn't used to making a production on this scale. So there were lots of things that went wrong, I think, in his first couple of blocks, and that soured him against the production. And I think soured him against the role, but fortunately he has come back to it over the years via Big Finish. I haven't heard any of the audios, but I've heard clips. I'm glad he's embraced it now, because for a while he did seem to turn his back on it, which is a shame, because he was fantastic. A great rapport with Billie Piper as Rose. And he brought a humanity to it, which I think it needed. I know a lot of people think that the Doctor should be this distant alien. But I think he brought that plus a sadness and a poignancy and a humanity to the character, which I think it needs. You can't do a drama series these days with this cold, emotionless lead character. You have to give them dimensions for the audience to invest in. I think he did that brilliantly. And as with William Hartnell, if he hadn't made a go of it in that series, the show would have faded away forever and it wouldn't have come back again. That would have been the last chance. So Christopher Eccleston, I think quite rightly, comes in at number 5. Lastly then, for this episode, at number 4 in my rankings is Patrick Troughton.
Oh, I see. How interesting.
And again, in fact, these three have all got similar aspects to their characters, because if each of these actors, Hartnell, Eccleston and now Troughton, hadn't made the character work, the series would have died. Patrick Troughton, of course, took on the mantle from William Hartnell. He was the second Doctor when William Hartnell became too ill to continue. And again, if his version of this character hadn't worked, then it would have died in the 60s. It would have carried on for a couple of years, and eventually the BBC would have swung the axe, which they very nearly did at the end of his third and final season. Because as much as we venerate Patrick Troughton, the ratings for his episodes did dip. They sort of picked up a bit and they dipped alarmingly towards the end of his run. The show was getting sort of 4 or 5 million towards the end. And that's why the BBC were considering at that point ringing the changes and bringing in something new. It's only the fact they couldn't think of something made them renew the series into the 70s. But Troughton himself, he very sensibly realised he couldn't just impersonate William Hartnell. And this, of course, was a groundbreaking move at the time, to replace a lead actor playing the same part. I mean, you can replace an actor playing a role in a series with a similar character, which is what they've done in things like Midsummer Murders, Death in Paradise these days. The lead character goes, but you bring in another character played by a different actor, fulfilling the same role. But this is the same man, this is the same person, a different aspect of that person played by somebody else. And I think everybody realised that you can't do a William Hartnell impression, there's no point in that. So he flipped the coin and became this pixie-like elfin bloke who, and you can see where Peter Davison got it from, this sort of slightly flustered out of, you know, not in control of everything, but secretly thinking and planning and understanding and strategizing. And he played it with this charm, with this sort of Beatles-type haircut and these, whereas William Hartnell's Doctor had been quite smart in his Edwardian clothes. Troughton's Doctor was scruffy. He had a scruffy coat and trousers, and his collar was always a mess, and bow ties and things. So he always looked like the Charlie Chaplin figure he's often described as. But he pulled it off perfectly. A really nice contrast from Hartnell to give a different aspect to the character, which I think we've had really pretty much from all the regenerations of the Doctor, different sides of the same coin. Of course, he was helped by the fact that certainly in his second series, the classic second series, sadly too much of which is missing, was what they call the monster season, where you had the great explosion of creativity in terms of alien creatures. You had the Ice Warriors first appearing, the Cybermen being constantly redefined, the Daleks coming back in a really iconic story, the legendary Fury from the Deep with the seaweed creature, the Chameleons and the Faceless One. It was just story after story with these great iconic creatures. Which is certainly his strongest season, and unfortunately his third season fell away. There were lots of production problems and the stories were a little bit tattier and a bit more ragged, which is why he decided to leave. I think it was the year-round production schedule and the scripts weren't as good. But through it all, Troughton just glowed as this wildly eccentric, effervescent, energetic character who bounded through the adventures, looking out of his depth, but never actually being out of his depth. And of course, we have to mention his companions, the resourceful and trustworthy Jamie, and loyal Jamie, played by Fraser Hines, who was there from almost the very beginning. He appeared in Troughton's second serial, The Highlanders, which also no longer exists. And he was there right the way through to the end. You had Ben and Polly, who stuck around from Hartnell's era for a while. Then you had Victoria, played by Deborah Watling, and Zoe, played by Wendy Padbury. And it's funny, when I think of classic Doctor Who, I always think of like the Doctor and Jamie and Zoe, or the Doctor, Jamie and Victoria, that sort of an iconic lineup for the TARDIS. So yeah, we have to acknowledge Patrick Troughton's turn. It's a great performance. He is a terrific actor anyway. And he just sees the character and and spun it round and showed that you could do something with the same character. And I think that's something which is fundamental to what the Doctor is. But as I say, if he hadn't done that, if he hadn't worked, if he had just done a poor William Hartnell impression, the show wouldn't have survived. And I think it's a tribute to his performance throughout those 3 years that even when it came close to being cancelled, wiser heads prevailed at the BBC, and they presumably saw, well, this is a show that can reinvent itself. Let's give it another chance. So there we are. Patrick Troughton's number 4 on my list. Right, hope you've enjoyed this slightly shorter, I think, episode of Doctor Who Rankings. The 4th and final episode will be coming up in the next 7 days. I've put these 3 out fairly quickly. I'll have a little gap before the next one just to build up the anticipation. So yeah, to come back for the next episode. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I hope that whether you agree or disagree with my rankings previously or even this one, you'll take it in good part and realise, as I've said, it's my opinion. Your opinion may well be different, but we're all entitled to our opinions. We're entitled to express them. If you've enjoyed this video, why not like and subscribe? Why not leave a comment down below? And all that sort of stuff. I will see you soon for episode 4 and hopefully some more bits and pieces. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.